The Agenda with Steve Paikin is presented by
Vale Inco Limited, a pioneering nickel mining company transforming mineral resources into essential ingredients for everyday life. Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at casforchange.ca.
And joining us now on the debate, in the nation's capital, retired Colonel Alain Pellerin, Executive Director of the Conference of Defence Associations. In Kitchener, Ontario, Mark Cedra, Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. And here in studio, Mercedes Stevenson, military analyst and also host and producer of her own show on iChannel. Stephen Staples, president of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. And Graeme Smith, the Emmy-winning reporter at the Globe and Mail who covered the war in southern Afghanistan from 2006, now working on a book on the subject. Thanks to all of you for joining us here in studio and in Points Beyond this evening. I want to start by saying something that I think may come as a surprise to many of our viewers, which is this war in Afghanistan began 8 years ago tomorrow. 8 years already. Britain and the U.S. launching military attacks to overthrow the Taliban. On that day, our Prime Minister of the time, Jean Chrétien, addressed the Canadian public, and here's some of what he had to say. Roll tape.
We are part of an unprecedented coalition of nations that has come together to fight the threat of terrorism. A coalition that will act on a broad front that includes military, humanitarian, diplomatic, financial, legislative, and domestic security initiative. I have made it clear from the very beginning that Canada will be part of this coalition every step of the way. On Friday evening, the United States asked Canada to make certain contributions as part of a multinational military coalition against international terrorism. I immediately instructed our Minister of National Defense to agree. Yesterday, I met with the Chief of the National Defense Staff to confirm the type of role that Canada was being asked to play. And shortly before noon today, I confirmed to President Bush in a telephone conversation that will provide the military support requested.
Let's go around the horn on this as we review 8 years of Canadian defence policy. Mercedes, to you first. With the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, should Canada have responded differently?
Steve, I don't think that we should have responded differently in terms of our involvement going into Afghanistan. I mean, let's remember that the reason why we went there is because we are a part of NATO, and we were called upon under our Article 5 obligations. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's why Canada went into Afghanistan. In terms of our actual strategy, not just as Canadians, but as NATO allies, were there strategic errors made and blunders? Absolutely. The international community did not pay enough attention to Afghanistan, did not make sufficient commitment, not only on the military side, but on the development side and on the diplomatic side. And those errors have come back to haunt us, and we're seeing that now.
Steve Staples.
Well, I think at the time we went in to ensure that al-Qaeda would never become a threat to the international community again. And I'm relieved to hear John Manley in the tape earlier say that he believes that al-Qaeda is no longer a threat there. So I think mission accomplished. That was the original outset. But Steve, I think the question is not so much, have we made a real difference and changed Afghanistan? What keeps me up at night is I wonder whether Afghanistan has changed us. I read the newspapers 2 weeks ago with stories splashed across the headlines across this country that rampant child abuse has been going on amongst the Afghan National Army soldiers, not outside Canadian bases, but inside Canadian bases, and that our troops have been told to look the other way. And I wonder, how can we be defending human rights when we know this is happening? Shouldn't we be looking into this? So I think it has changed Canada, and maybe not for the better.
Alain Pellerin, with 8 years of hindsight, should we have responded differently?
I think we took the right decision at the time. We have to remember, when you say 8 years of war, that after the defeat of the Taliban, that mission was very much under-resourced by the Americans because they had their focus on Iraq, and our focus was more on Kabul. We were in Kabul until 2005, and it's only in 2006 that we and the coalition moved in the south where the vital ground of the Taliban used to be and where the war is now. So when we say 8 years, I think we have to be careful. A lot of these operations take a long time. We forget, for instance, we were in Cyprus for 30 years. We were in the Golan Heights for over 30 years. So, we have to remember that those are very complicated issues, and they take a long time to resolve. Look at Northern Ireland, 25 years to resolve the IRA.
No, Colonel,
issue.
I appreciate your point, but some people will say World War II was ended in 6, and here we are just fighting in one country, and it's 8 years later, and they're not sure we've made enough progress.
Yeah, but you have to remember World War II, World War I was fought between nations, and nations, it's easier to defeat the nation, declare victory, and have victory parade. Now you're fighting against insurgents that don't hold ground per se. It takes a much longer time to defeat insurgents. We saw that in Malaya, for instance. We saw that in Northern Ireland.
Mark Sedra, what do you say?
Patience.
Sorry, Mark Sedra, what is your view?
Well, I think it was absolutely imperative that Canada be involved in Afghanistan 8 years ago. I think there was very strong strategic reasons to be there. We can't forget that the September 11th terrorist attacks were planned in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had a very sophisticated network and establishment in Afghanistan. It virtually had a state within the Afghan state itself, the Taliban state. So I think it was absolutely essential to disrupt that. I don't really buy the current argument that Al-Qaeda now is gone from Afghanistan or there's just a few hundred left. No. The reality is that if the international community were to leave tomorrow, that it's very possible, and in my view likely, that within the next few years you could see some sort of civil war emerge, and Al-Qaeda will emerge right there in that vacuum. So you can't leave the job half done. And to just concur what the last speaker said, you cannot rebuild a failed state in 8 years. The reality is this was one of the poorest countries in the world before a 30-year civil war. It's not that you can go in and, as was said earlier, merely establish state structures right out of a box and expect the country to stabilize. It takes time. And unfortunately, Western states aren't very patient.
Graeme Smith, I suspect you have spent as much time in Afghanistan as any Canadian not wearing a military uniform. So I want your view on this as well. With the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, did we make the right decision back then?
Obviously, the international community had to take action against Al-Qaeda. I think the international community rushed into the war in 2001. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if we had waited a little longer and negotiated a little more carefully to get the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. Or, there are other mistakes that could have been avoided in 2001. Tora Bora, you could have sent in the special forces rather than sending in your Afghan proxies. There are all kinds of things we could have done to try to attack Al-Qaeda in a more effective way in those early years.
If memory serves, I think they waited about 6 weeks before attacking, and many, particularly Americans at the time, were saying, 6 weeks? Why have we waited that long? Let's get over there. Let's get going. Pretty hard to wait when the bloodlust is in the air, isn't it?
Time moves differently in the American political process than it does in southern Afghanistan, that's for sure. I think the point that Mr. Pellerin made that we need to be patient makes me a little worried, because every year that I was there, I first arrived in 2005. The next year, 2006, was more bloody. The year after that, 2007, was more bloody. The year after that, 2008, was more bloody. The year after that, 2009, was still more bloody. And so I'm wondering, how much patience do you want the Afghans to have with this process? How many tens of thousands of Afghans need to die in order to achieve whatever political objectives you're hoping to achieve?
Mercedes, has Canada achieved any of the objectives that brought it to Afghanistan in the first place?
I think we've achieved some of the objectives. I think we haven't achieved all of them.
Okay, which ones have we? Because from what I just hear from Graeme, it doesn't sound like it.
Well, I think that we've begun to make progress in terms of individual Afghans. There is healthcare in areas where there was not healthcare. For example, Canada has built a maternity ward. There's never been a maternity ward in Afghanistan before. Women had no access to maternal health care. Is that a very small step? Yes, but it's a step. In the case of the marital rape law that came through, which was abhorrent to Canadians, there was actually women protesting in the streets. Of course, it's not acceptable that the Afghan president was willing to power broker a deal that saw women's rights sacrificed, but women were actually able to go out into the streets and protest. That could have never happened under Taliban rule.